The storm arrived without warning. Not the gentle kind that whispered against windows and faded before midnight. No, this storm rolled across the English countryside like wrath itself. Thunder cracked over the hills of Blackthorne Estate. Rain lashed against the carriage windows with such violence that even the Duke's horses fought against the road. Inside the carriage, the Duke of Ravenshire sat in silence. His gloved hand rested against his jaw, his gaze distant beneath the flickering lantern light. 7 months. 7 months since he had abandoned London society. 7 months since the scandal. And 7 months since he had stepped foot inside Blackthorne Estate. The servants would not be expecting him tonight. No one would. The Duke closed his eyes briefly as thunder shook the carriage. "You should rest, Your Grace," his driver shouted from outside. The Duke gave no answer. Rest. He almost laughed at the word. Men like him did not rest. Not after war. Not after betrayal. Not after burying the only woman who had ever loved him honestly. Another crack of thunder split the sky. The carriage jerked violently, then stopped. The Duke's eyes opened instantly. "What is it? Mudslide on the lower road, Your Grace," the driver yelled. "We'll need to continue through the forest pass." The Duke looked out the rain-streaked window toward the dark woods ahead. Blackthorne Forest. Even in daylight, the woods carried an unsettling beauty, ancient twisted trees, thick mist curling between roots. Villagers often whispered stories about the forest, swallowing travellers whole. Tonight it looked cursed. "Continue," the Duke ordered calmly. The carriage lurched forward once more. Hours later, the iron gates of Blackthorne Estate finally emerged through the rain. Massive, dark, silent, lightning illuminated the enormous manor atop the hill. It stood exactly as he remembered, cold, lonely, waiting. The carriage stopped beneath the stone entrance. Before the footman could open the door, the Duke stepped out into the storm himself. Rain soaked his black coat instantly. One servant rushed forward in panic. "Your Grace!" "We did not know you would return tonight." Clearly. His deep voice silenced everyone immediately. Servants hurried across the entrance hall, lighting candles and gathering luggage. Fear followed him naturally. It always had. The Duke stepped inside the manor slowly and paused. Something was wrong. The fireplace in the grand hall was lit, freshly lit, warm. Someone had been here recently. The Duke's eyes narrowed. "I left instructions for this wing to remain closed." The servants exchanged nervous glances. It was closed, Your Grace," the butler stammered. "We believed it was." The Duke removed his glove slowly. Then he heard it, a child's laugh, soft, tiny, coming from the drawing room. Every servant froze. The Duke turned toward the sound immediately. Another laugh followed. Then a woman's voice. "Hush now, someone will hear you." The Duke's expression darkened instantly. Without a word, he strode across the grand hall. The butler nearly choked. "Your Grace, perhaps we should." But the Duke had already pushed open the drawing-room doors and stopped cold. The room glowed gold beneath firelight. A woman sat asleep near the fireplace, curled protectively against the armchair. A small child rested against her chest beneath layers of blankets. The boy could not have been older than 4. Rainwater still clung to the woman's dress. Her shoes were muddy. Exhaustion painted every inch of her face. Yet even asleep, she was beautiful. Not in the polished London way, not adorned in jewels or powdered perfumes. No, this beauty was dangerous because it looked real. Soft brown curls had escaped her bonnet entirely. Her lips were pale from cold. One delicate hand remained wrapped protectively around the sleeping child, even in unconsciousness. The Duke stared silently. Who the hell was she? The child stirred first. Large eyes blinked open sleepily, then widened at the sight of the towering man standing near the doorway. "Mamma?" The woman woke instantly. Panic flooded her face. She stood so quickly the blankets fell to the floor. "Oh, God!" Her terrified gaze landed on the Duke, and for one brief moment the room forgot how to breathe, because the Duke of Ravenshire was devastating to look at up close. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair damp from rain, a black coat clinging slightly to his frame, and eyes so cold they looked carved from winter itself. The woman instinctively stepped in front of the child, protecting him. The Duke noticed immediately. Interesting. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. His voice was calm, which somehow made it more frightening. The woman swallowed hard. I apologize, Your Grace." So she knew who he was. "We did not mean to intrude." "We?" "My son and I." The Duke's gaze moved to the child again. The little boy stared back curiously from behind his mother's skirts, not afraid. Most people feared the Duke instantly. This child did not. "How did you enter my home?" "One of the side doors was unlatched," she answered honestly. The storm became dangerous. My son was freezing. I only wanted shelter for the night. The Duke studied her carefully. Her dress was plain, though clearly once expensive. Not a servant. Not a thief either. There was refinement in the way she spoke, in the way she stood despite exhaustion. Yet something about her looked ruined, as though life had stripped everything from her except dignity. The butler finally rushed into the room behind him. "Your Grace, shall I call the guards?" The child instantly clung tighter to his mother. Fear flashed across her face. "Please," she whispered, "we have nowhere else to go." Silence. Rain battered the windows. The Duke should have thrown them out immediately. Any other nobleman would have. Yet strangely, he did not move. The woman's eyes lifted toward his again, and for the first time, the Duke noticed the bruise hidden faintly beneath her collar. Very old, but unmistakable. His jaw tightened slightly. "Your name," he said. She hesitated, as though names themselves had become dangerous. "Elena." "And the boy, Thomas." The child peeked around her dress again, then unexpectedly said, "You look angry." The servants gasped quietly. The Duke stared at the boy. Then, to everyone's shock, a faint amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Only for a second, gone almost instantly. "What gave you that impression?" the Duke asked. Thomas pointed innocently. "Your face." The room fell into horrified silence. The butler nearly looked ready to faint, but Elena quickly pulled her son back. "Thomas, it is quite all right," the Duke interrupted smoothly, and strangely, it was. The Duke walked further into the room now, slowly, like a predator testing unfamiliar territory. Elena tensed immediately. He noticed that too. Fear, not social discomfort, real fear, as if she expected violence from men. Interesting again. The Duke stopped beside the fireplace, close enough now to see the exhaustion in her eyes properly. "You travelled during a storm with a child," he said quietly. "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the boy's shoulder. "That is not your concern, Your Grace." Ah, there it was. Spirit. Most women in her situation would beg. This one guarded herself like a cornered wolf. The Duke looked toward the fire, then finally said, "You may stay tonight." Elena blinked in shock. "My lord, you will leave in the morning." Relief flooded her face so suddenly it almost hurt to witness. "Thank you." The Duke turned toward the servants. "Prepare the east guest chambers." The butler hesitated nervously. "Your Grace, the east wing has remained closed since—" "I am aware." Instant silence followed. The servants obeyed immediately. Elena looked confused by the sudden tension in the room. The Duke noticed, but explained nothing. He never explained himself. As servants moved to escort her upstairs, Thomas suddenly tugged his mother's hand. "Mamma, what is it?" The child looked directly at the Duke, then smiled brightly. "Good night, angry man." A servant dropped an entire tray. Elena looked mortified. But before she could apologize, the Duke did something no one in Blackthorne Estate had seen in years. He laughed, quietly, deeply, briefly, like thunder softening, and the entire room froze in disbelief. Because men like the Duke of Ravenshire were not supposed to laugh anymore, especially not for strangers, especially not for a woman with haunted eyes and a child who was clearly hiding from something. But as Elena disappeared up the staircase, the Duke found himself watching her far longer than he should have. And for the first time in years, Blackthorne Estate no longer felt empty. The storm worsened after midnight. Wind clawed against the ancient windows of Blackthorne Estate, while thunder rolled endlessly across the hills. Most of the servants had long since retired to their quarters, yet the manor itself remained awake somehow. Old houses remembered things, and Blackthorne remembered grief better than most. The Duke stood alone in his study, a glass of untouched whisky resting near his hand. The fire crackled quietly. His gaze remained fixed on the rain outside. Yet his thoughts were no longer on London, nor war, nor the ghosts that haunted this estate. They lingered upstairs now, a woman with frightened eyes, and a child who looked at him without fear. The Duke exhaled slowly. Dangerous, not them. The feeling, he disliked being curious about anyone. Curiosity led to attachment. Attachment led to loss. He had learned that lesson thoroughly. A knock interrupted the silence. "Enter." The butler stepped carefully inside. "Your Grace, the guests have been settled." Guests. Interesting choice of word. The Duke said nothing. The butler hesitated. "The child requested extra bread." The Duke looked over. "Requested?" "Yes, Your Grace, and we provided it immediately." A pause. Twice. Something unreadable crossed the Duke's face. Twice. The boy had asked twice because he was hungry enough to ignore manners, meaning this was not one difficult night. They had been struggling for some time. "Have the kitchens prepare breakfast in the morning," the Duke ordered quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." The butler turned to leave, then stopped nervously. "There is one more matter." The Duke waited. The woman appears frightened of men. Silence filled the study. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly. "I noticed." The old butler lowered his voice carefully. "She bears bruises, Your Grace." The Duke's expression darkened instantly. Not surprise, recognition. He had seen bruises before. On battlefields, on women trapped in cruel marriages, on servants punished by drunken masters, and once on his mother. A dangerous stillness settled over the room. "Find out who she is," the Duke said coldly. "Yes, Your Grace," and discreetly. The butler bowed and disappeared. The Duke remained motionless beside the fire for a long time afterward. Then finally, he finished the whiskey in one swallow. Upstairs, Elena could not sleep. The guest chamber was enormous compared to anything she had stayed in for months. Warm gold curtains framed tall windows. Candles flickered softly beside an enormous bed. Fresh blankets had been prepared. Luxury. Real luxury. She had almost forgotten what it looked like. Thomas slept soundly beside her, beneath layers of blankets, finally warm for the first time in days. But Elena remained awake. Fear did not disappear simply because walls became beautiful. She sat near the edge of the bed, quietly listening to the storm. Then a soft knock came at the door. Her body stiffened instantly. Thomas stirred faintly. Another knock followed, gentler this time. "My lady," an elderly female voice called softly. "May I enter?" Elena hesitated, then slowly opened the door. An older housekeeper stood there carrying a silver tray, soup, bread, tea. The smell alone nearly broke Elena's composure. "You have not eaten properly," the housekeeper said kindly. "Neither has the child." Elena immediately looked away. Humiliation burned her cheeks. "We cannot repay this kindness." The older woman's expression softened. His Grace did not ask for repayment. That surprised her. The housekeeper placed the tray carefully near the fireplace, then glanced toward the sleeping boy. "He resembles you." Elena smiled faintly for the first time that night. "He thankfully does not resemble his father." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Silence followed instantly. The housekeeper studied her carefully now, not judging, understanding. Ah, so she knew. Women always knew. "I shall return in the morning," the housekeeper said quietly. "Thank you." After the door closed, Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. Thomas woke slightly as she carried the soup over. "Mamma?" "Yes, darling?" "Are we safe here?" The question shattered something inside her, because she did not know. The Duke frightened her. Not because he seemed cruel, but because powerful men always came with danger. Always. Yet, he had looked at Thomas differently, not with annoyance, not with disgust, almost with curiosity. That was rare. Thomas rubbed his sleepy eyes. "The angry man is sad," Elena blinked. "What?" "The big man downstairs." Thomas yawned. "His eyes are sad. Children noticed everything." She brushed curls from his forehead gently. "Sleep now." But long after Thomas drifted off again, Elena found herself thinking about the Duke's eyes too. Cold, yes, but cold things often hid wounds beneath them. The next morning, Blackthorne Estate awoke to chaos, because the Duke had entered the breakfast hall early, and he was not alone. Servants nearly collided into walls, trying not to stare. Elena sat across from him, carefully dressed in a simple dark blue gown the housekeeper had provided. Thomas sat beside her, enthusiastically eating strawberries as though he had never seen fruit before in his life. The Duke noticed that too. Every detail, every small sign of hardship. Elena noticed his observations and became tense again instantly. "You need not look so prepared for battle," the Duke said calmly while pouring tea. "I beg your pardon? You have spent the entire morning waiting for me to demand something in return for your stay." Her fingers tightened around the teacup because he was correct. The Duke leaned back slightly. "You may relax, Mrs. Silence." He noticed immediately, no ring, no husband present, yet she had a child and fear. Interesting. "Elena is sufficient," she answered quietly. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. Avoidance again. Thomas suddenly interrupted loudly. "This house is bigger than God." A servant choked violently. The Duke looked at the child. "Is that so?" Thomas nodded seriously. "There are too many rooms." For the second time, the Duke nearly smiled. Elena stared at him in disbelief. How strange. The rumours in London described the Duke of Ravenshire as merciless, cold, untouchable. Women adored him from afar, while men feared crossing him. Yet here he was listening to a child ramble about hallways. Thomas pointed suddenly toward a massive painting above the fireplace. "Who is she?" The room changed instantly. The Duke looked up slowly. A woman stared down from the portrait, beautiful, elegant, golden-haired, her smile soft and haunting, the late Duchess of Ravenshire, the Duke's dead wife. Every servant in the room lowered their gaze immediately. Elena realised too late what the boy had asked. "I apologise. That was my wife," the Duke said quietly. Silence followed. Thomas studied the painting curiously. "She looks nice." The Duke's expression did not change. She was. Elena noticed something then. The Duke never looked directly at the portrait for long, as though it physically hurt him. Thomas tilted his head innocently. "Did she die?" Another servant dropped a spoon. Elena nearly died of horror. "Thomas," but the Duke simply answered, "Yes." The child considered this solemnly. "Did it make you angry forever?" The room froze. Elena could barely breathe. Yet strangely, the Duke answered again, "No." His gaze shifted toward the fire. "It made me tired forever." And for the first time, Elena saw the man beneath the title. Not merely a powerful duke, not merely a feared aristocrat, but someone carrying grief so heavily it had reshaped him completely. Their eyes met briefly across the breakfast table, and something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, two wounded people noticing the scars in each other. Then suddenly, the breakfast hall doors burst open. A soaked footman hurried inside breathlessly. "Your Grace!" The Duke stood immediately. "What is it? Horses approaching the estate." The footman swallowed hard. "There are armed men with them." Elena went completely pale. The Duke noticed instantly, and in that single moment, he understood. They were not running from poverty. They were hiding from someone. The Duke's eyes locked onto Elena instantly, and whatever colour remained in her face disappeared completely. Fear, not surprise, not inconvenience. Fear. Real fear. Thomas noticed it. The little boy slid from his chair and immediately clung to her side. "Mamma?" Elena's hand trembled slightly against his shoulder. The Duke saw that as well. Every servant in the breakfast hall stood frozen as thunder rolled faintly outside. "How many men?" the Duke asked calmly. "4 riders, Your Grace," the footman answered. "Perhaps 5. Elena shut her eyes briefly, as though the number itself confirmed something terrible. The Duke turned toward her slowly. "Who are they?" Silence. She could not answer, or would not. Her breathing had changed now, shorter, uneven. The Duke had seen battlefield panic before. This resembled it. "Look at me," he said quietly. She did. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Estate, Elena looked genuinely cornered. "They cannot find us," she whispered. "Us, not me." The Duke glanced briefly toward Thomas. "Interesting." The footman shifted nervously near the doorway. "They are requesting entry, Your Grace." The Duke's expression hardened instantly. "No." The single word carried enough authority to silence the entire room. The footman bowed quickly and disappeared. Elena stared at him in shock. "You do not even know who they are?" "No," the Duke agreed calmly. "But I know fear when I see it." The room fell silent again. The Duke walked toward the windows slowly, looking out toward the distant gates below. Several riders waited near the entrance, dark coats, well-bred horses, not common criminals. One rider in particular sat unnaturally still in the saddle, watching the exit, watching the house. The Duke disliked him immediately. "Stay here," he ordered Elena. "No." The answer came too quickly. The Duke turned. Elena stood now, pale but determined. "You do not understand, then explain." She looked toward Thomas. The child stared back silently now, sensing the danger. Elena lowered her voice. "If those men seize him, they will take him." Something cold moved through the Duke's chest. "Why?" Her lips parted slightly, but before she could answer, another servant rushed inside. "Your Grace, the gentleman at the gates claims to be Sir Cedric Vale." The reaction Elena had this time was worse. Far worse. She physically stepped backward. Like someone hearing the name of a nightmare. The Duke noticed immediately. "Who is Sir Cedric Vale?" Elena looked as though she wanted to speak. Instead she whispered, "My husband." Silence crashed through the room. Even the servants exchanged startled glances. The Duke's eyes darkened slowly. Husband. Interesting. Very interesting. Because no woman fled through storms with bruises while protecting her child from her husband, unless something monstrous lived inside that marriage. Thomas buried his face into Elena's skirts. "I do not want to go with him," the child whispered. The Duke heard it clearly, so did everyone else, and suddenly the atmosphere inside the breakfast hall changed entirely. The Duke spoke carefully now. "Did your husband harm you?" Elena looked away. Answer enough. The Duke's jaw tightened. "And the child?" This time her silence lasted too long. Much too long. A dangerous stillness entered the Duke's voice. "Did he harm the boy?" "No," she said instantly. Too instantly, the Duke noticed. She realized it immediately, but it was too late. The Duke walked toward her slowly, not threatening, but impossible to ignore. Mrs. Vale. Elena. Very well. His voice lowered. Why is your husband searching for the child? She said nothing. Thunder shook the windows. Down below, the riders still waited beyond the gates. The Duke could feel tension spreading through the estate like smoke. Finally, Elena spoke. My husband cannot father children. The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. He discovered I was pregnant shortly after returning from London 3 years ago. Thomas clung tighter to her hand. He accused me of disgracing him, of humiliating him. Her voice trembled slightly now. At first he merely shouted. Merely. The Duke hated that word instantly. Elena continued quietly. Then he began drinking. The servants lowered their eyes. No one interrupted. Eventually, he became convinced the child could still benefit him somehow. The Duke's voice turned colder. How? Tears filled her eyes for the first time. My husband is drowning in debt. Understanding dawned slowly across the Duke's face. Aristocratic inheritance laws, titles, bloodlines, claims. A child could become valuable under the right circumstances, especially if powerful families became involved. He intends to sell custody of the boy to one of his relatives, Elena whispered. A cousin without heirs. The room went dead silent. Thomas buried his face against her waist. The Duke felt something dark begin to move beneath his ribs. Rage. Pure, controlled, dangerous. He had spent years mastering anger, but some things still tested that control. A man selling a child was one of them. Why run now? He asked. Elena swallowed hard. Because yesterday, her voice cracked, I overheard him discussing how much money Thomas would bring. The Duke looked toward the boy. The child stared back quietly with enormous frightened eyes. And something shifted inside the Duke then. Something unexpected, because Blackthorne Estate had once been meant for children. Laughter, family, life, all buried with his wife years ago. Yet suddenly, a small, muddy boy sat in his breakfast hall, eating strawberries while hiding from monsters. And the Duke found himself thinking one terrifying thing. Mine to protect. The realization unsettled him immediately. Downstairs, the front doors suddenly opened. Heavy footsteps echoed through the entrance hall. The butler hurried into the breakfast room looking horrified. Your Grace, too late. A man entered behind him, tall, handsome in the polished way cruel men often were. Rain clung to his dark riding coat. Sharp eyes scanned the room instantly, then landed on Elena. There you are, Thomas whimpered softly. Elena went pale again. Sir Cedric Vale smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Darling, he said smoothly, you've caused quite the inconvenience. The Duke stepped forward immediately, not aggressively. Worse, calmly. You entered my estate uninvited. Cedric finally looked toward him properly. Recognition flashed instantly. Ah, now there was caution. The Duke of Ravenshire. Cedric bowed slightly. Forgive the intrusion. My wife appears to have become confused. Elena flinched visibly. The Duke noticed. So did Cedric, and that tiny reaction told the Duke everything he needed to know. Cedric's smile tightened faintly. I have simply come to retrieve my family. The Duke's voice remained even. The lady and child are under my protection. Shock crossed Cedric's face. Then amusement. With respect, Your Grace. This is a domestic matter. The Duke's eyes turned glacial. No, the single word hit the room like steel. Cedric's expression hardened now. I believe you misunderstand your position. I understand it perfectly. The Duke moved slightly closer. Every servant in the room became visibly tense. Because the Duke of Ravenshire was dangerous when calm, everyone knew that. I also understand, the Duke continued softly, that your wife fears you. Cedric laughed lightly. Women are emotional creatures. Elena's hands shook. Thomas hid behind her completely now. The Duke saw both reactions, and whatever patience remained inside him vanished. You will leave my estate, the Duke said quietly. Cedric's smile disappeared. You would interfere in another nobleman's marriage? The Duke's gaze never left his. Yes, silence. Pure tension. Then Cedric made a mistake. He reached suddenly for Elena's wrist. She recoiled instantly, and Thomas cried out, Don't touch her! The room froze. Cedric's face darkened immediately. The Duke moved before anyone realized it. Fast, violently fast. One moment Cedric stood beside Elena, the next. The Duke had slammed him backward against the wall hard enough to shake the paintings. Gasps erupted throughout the room. The Duke's hand closed around Cedric's throat with terrifying calm. You will never raise your hand toward them again, he said softly. And somehow, that quiet voice sounded more frightening than shouting ever could. Sir Cedric's face reddened instantly beneath the Duke's grip. The breakfast hall stood frozen in horror. No one moved, no one breathed. Because the Duke of Ravenshire had a reputation for control, absolute control, and seeing that control crack even slightly was enough to terrify everyone in the room. Cedric clawed weakly at the Duke's wrist. "You cannot what?" the Duke asked quietly. His voice remained calm. That was the worst part. Elena stared in shock. Thomas clung tightly to her skirts, eyes wide. The servants exchanged nervous glances, but none dared interfere. Not with the Duke looking like that. Years of buried fury flickered behind his eyes now. Not wild anger, cold anger. The kind that calculated exactly how much damage it could do. Cedric forced out a strained laugh despite the pressure against his throat. "You would assault a peer over a woman you met last night?" The Duke's grip tightened slightly. Cedric winced. Then Elijah. The voice was soft, but it stopped everything. Elena had spoken his first name. The Duke looked at her immediately. No one called him that anymore. Not servants, not society, not even his friends. Only one person ever had, his dead wife. The room became strangely still. Elena seemed to realize too late what she had done, but her eyes held his steadily. "Please," she whispered. "Not in front of Thomas." The Duke looked toward the boy. Thomas was trembling now. Fear, not of Cedric, of him, and instantly, the Duke released Cedric. Cedric stumbled backward violently, coughing. The Duke stepped away without another glance. Like a king deciding someone beneath him no longer deserved attention, Cedric steadied himself slowly, rage simmering beneath his polished appearance now. "You forget yourself, Ravenshire." "No," the Duke replied coldly. "You forget where you stand." The two men stared at one another across the room. Thunder rumbled outside again. Cedric adjusted his coat slowly, then smiled. But now the mask had slipped. Cruelty lived openly beneath it. "Elena is my wife." Elena visibly stiffened. "And Thomas?" the Duke asked quietly. Something dangerous flickered in Cedric's eyes. "Thomas belongs to me." The boy whimpered softly. The Duke heard it, so did Elena, and suddenly something inside her snapped. "No," she said. Cedric looked stunned. Elena stepped forward protectively, placing herself fully between Thomas and her husband. "No," she repeated stronger this time. "He is not property." Cedric's face darkened instantly. "You embarrass yourself. You sold my jewellery. Silence. You drank away our money. Another silence. You called our son a burden." Cedric moved toward her sharply. "Elena." The Duke took one step forward. Just one. Cedric stopped immediately. The atmosphere in the room turned lethal. Elena's breathing trembled now, but she kept speaking anyway. "For 3 years I remained silent because I believed surviving was enough." Tears filled her eyes. "But yesterday I heard you discussing my child like livestock." Thomas buried his face against her again. "And I realized—" Her voice broke softly. Silence would destroy him too. The Duke watched her carefully. There it was, courage. Not the loud dramatic kind society celebrated. The real kind. The kind born from terror. Cedric laughed bitterly. "You think anyone will protect you?" He gestured toward the Duke mockingly. "This man?" His eyes shifted toward Ravenshire. "He is infamous for burying himself alongside his dead wife. Half of London believes he barely remembers how to feel." The servants looked horrified. No one spoke of the Duchess in front of the Duke. Ever, yet strangely. The Duke did not react because his attention remained fixed on Elena, and Elena alone. She looked at him then. Not frightened, not uncertain, simply watching him quietly, as though trying to understand the man beneath the title too. Cedric noticed the look between them, and immediately hated it. Ah, jealousy. Interesting. "You do not know what he is," Cedric sneered. The Duke finally looked toward him. "No," Cedric continued coldly. "Perhaps she should know." The room tensed instantly. Even the Duke's expression shifted slightly. Cedric smiled slowly. "Tell her how your wife died." Silence crashed through the hall. The servants looked physically uncomfortable now. Elena frowned faintly. The Duke's jaw tightened once, only once, but it was enough. Cedric saw it and pressed further. "Go on, your Grace." The Duke's eyes turned dangerous. Cedric continued anyway. "Tell her why London whispers whenever your name is mentioned." Elena glanced between them uncertainly. The Duke's voice became deathly quiet. "Leave," Cedric smirked. "Or perhaps I shall tell for myself." And then he made his second mistake. He looked directly at Elena and said, "The Duchess killed herself." The room stopped breathing. Thomas looked confused. Elena went still. The Duke did not move at all, which somehow felt worse. Cedric's voice lowered mockingly. "They found her in the lake behind the estate." No one dared look at the Duke now. Not even the servants. Some say grief drove her mad. Cedric smiled cruelly. Others say living with Ravenshire did. Elena's eyes shifted slowly toward the Duke. And for the first time since meeting him, she saw pain crack through the armour. only briefly. But enough. Enough to understand this wound had never healed. Cedric stepped backward toward the doorway, satisfied with the damage. Now, he said smoothly, I shall return tomorrow with proper legal authority. His gaze moved toward Elena. You cannot hide forever, then toward Thomas. And neither can the boy. The child shrank against Elena instantly. The Duke noticed that too. Cedric gave a mocking bow, then left. The massive doors shut behind him with a heavy echo. Silence remained. Terrible silence. The servants slowly disappeared from the room one by one, wisely fleeing before the storm truly broke. Soon only 4 people remained. The Duke, Elena, Thomas, and the ghosts. The Duke stood motionless near the windows, his expression unreadable again. Cold restored, walls rebuilt. Elena looked toward him carefully, then quietly said, I do not believe him. The Duke laughed once, a hollow sound. You should. Thomas looked between them uncertainly. Elena stepped closer slowly. You loved her. The Duke's eyes shifted toward her sharply. Not because of the statement, because of the certainty. Elena swallowed softly. I can see it. For a moment neither spoke. Rain slid quietly down the windows. Then the Duke finally said, You should take the boy upstairs. Dismissal. Distance. Elena recognized both instantly. But before she could respond, Thomas suddenly tugged the Duke's sleeve. The Duke looked down. The child stared up at him with heartbreaking seriousness. My papa shouts like thunder, Thomas whispered. But you look sad after. The Duke froze, and somehow that innocent observation hurt more than Cedric's cruelty ever could. Thomas reached into his tiny pocket slowly, then held out something small, a wooden horse, old, worn, broken slightly at one leg. My mamma says sad people should not stay alone, the child said softly. The Duke stared at the toy in silence. No one had offered him comfort in years, not since. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Thomas pushed the horse toward him again. You can borrow him. For a long moment the Duke did not move, not because he did not understand the gesture, but because he did. And that was precisely the problem. A broken wooden horse, missing a leg, offered by a child who had already seen too much fear for his age. The Duke slowly took it. His gloved fingers closed around the worn wood. The room felt strangely still, as though even the house itself was watching. Thomas smiled faintly, as if this was the most normal exchange in the world. There, the boy said softly. Now you are not alone. Eleanor's breath caught slightly at that, because she had seen men negotiate land, titles, fortunes, but she had never seen one disarmed by a child holding broken wood. The Duke stared at the toy for a moment longer. Then, very quietly, he said, Thank you. Thomas nodded as if he had just completed an important duty, then immediately returned to his mother's side, yawning. The moment passed. But something inside the Duke did not reset. Elena watched him carefully. The coldness had not disappeared. It never fully did, but it had shifted. Like ice cracking just enough to let something deeper breathe underneath. Elijah, she said again, more carefully this time. His gaze sharpened at her use of the name. Do not. A warning. Not loud, but absolute. Elena hesitated, then nodded slightly. Very well, Your Grace. A pause. Softer, thank you for earlier. The Duke did not respond. He turned away toward the window again, as though distance could restore control. Outside, the gates still stood closed. But Cedric Vale was not gone from the world. Men like him rarely accepted defeat. The Duke understood that very well. Behind him, Elena spoke again. He will come back with lawyers, I know. He will try to take Thomas legally. I know that as well. Silence followed. Then Elena said something quieter. So what happens now? The Duke did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the broken wooden horse in his hand. A child's belief that sadness could be fixed by not being alone. It was irrational. Impossible. And yet, when he finally spoke, his voice was lower. You will remain here. Elena blinked. I cannot impose on you. You are not imposing. The interruption was sharp enough to stop her. The Duke turned slightly now, his expression unreadable again, but something steadier underneath it. This estate is large enough to swallow half of England. 1 woman and a child will not disturb it. Elena frowned slightly. That is not what I mean. I am aware. A pause. Then, Cedric Vale will not be allowed through those gates again without my permission. Her eyes widened slightly. You would challenge him publicly. The Duke's gaze hardened. If necessary. That was not reassurance. It was declaration. Thomas had already fallen asleep again, curled against Elena's side on a nearby sofa. She gently adjusted his blanket before speaking. You do not owe us this. The Duke's answer came instantly. I am not doing this out of debt. Elena studied him carefully. Then why? For the first time in a while, the Duke did not respond immediately. The fire crackled between them. Rain pressed against the glass like impatient hands. Somewhere deep inside the estate, old memories stirred. A woman laughing in a garden, a voice calling his name. Then silence. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly. "I recognise what it looks like," he said finally. Elena did not speak. "You running," he continued. "A child being hidden. A man arriving to claim what he believes belongs to him." His eyes met hers. "And I do not allow that kind of thing in my house." Elena's expression softened slightly. "So it is duty." The Duke's gaze narrowed faintly. "No, that again." Elena waited. But he did not elaborate. Instead, he turned slightly toward the door. "You should rest. Tomorrow will not be quiet." As he moved to leave, Elena spoke again. "Your wife, the Duchess." The Duke stopped instantly, not turning, not answering. But stopping was enough permission for her to continue. "I am sorry." Silence stretched. Longer this time. He finally said very quietly, "You should not be." Elena hesitated, then added gently, "She would not want you to live like this." That did it. The air changed instantly. The Duke turned sharply now, eyes colder again, but not fully controlled. "You do not know what she would have wanted." Elena held her ground, even as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I know what grief does," she said softly. "It convinces you that suffering is loyalty. A beat, and it is not." For a moment the Duke said nothing. The fire popped sharply between them. Then he looked away. A fraction of something, pain, irritation, memory, passed through his face and vanished again. "Good night, Mrs. Vale." "Elena," she corrected gently. A pause. Then "Good night, Elena," and with that he left the room. The door closed softly behind him, but he did not go far. In the corridor outside the drawing-room the Duke stood still for a long time. The storm continued outside, and in his hand the broken wooden horse felt heavier than it should have. Because for the first time in years, Blackthorne Estate was no longer empty, and that, more than Cedric Vale's threats, felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous than war. The night deepened. Blackthorne Estate settled into an uneasy quiet, but it was not the kind of silence that meant peace. It was the kind that waited. The Duke remained in the corridor outside the drawing-room, long after the door closed behind him. The broken wooden horse sat in his hand like an accusation he could not quite understand. He turned it once, then again, as if expecting it to explain itself. It did not. A servant passed cautiously at the far end of the corridor, and immediately lowered his gaze, quickening his steps. No one dared linger near him when he was like this, silent, distant, sharpened into something dangerous. The Duke finally began walking. Not toward his chambers, not toward rest, toward the east wing. The sealed corridor, the one place in the entire estate no servant entered unless commanded. As he walked, the air seemed to change subtly. Warmer at first, then colder, then heavier, like memory itself had weight. He stopped before a tall set of double doors, old doors, dark wood, gold handles dulled with time. For a long moment he did not move. Then he pushed them open. The room inside was untouched. Not dusty in the way abandoned rooms usually were, but preserved, as though time itself had been instructed to avoid it. A grand bedroom. Soft curtains, a large bed still perfectly made, and above the fireplace a portrait, the Duchess of Ravenshire. Elena had seen it, but she had not stood here, not felt this. The Duke stepped inside slowly, closing the doors behind him. The sound echoed too loudly, too final. He walked toward the fireplace and stopped. The painting stared back at him. Her expression was gentle, alive in the way portraits always tried to imitate life. But she was not alive, not any more. His grip tightened slightly around the wooden horse. "You would not approve of this," he said quietly. No answer. Of course there wasn't. The fire in the hearth had long since died. Cold ashes remained. The Duke stood there for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced, not violent, not tragic, worse, ordinary. Her laughing in this very room. Her asking him to slow down when he worked too late. Her placing a hand over his as he tried to sign papers even during dinner. "You are not made of stone," she had once said. He had believed her, until she died. The Duke's jaw tightened. He placed the wooden horse on the mantel, right beneath the portrait. A strange offering, out of place, almost ridiculous, and yet he did not remove it. He stepped back, studying it, like it had changed something simply by existing here. Then a knock echoed softly from the door. He turned immediately, expression hardening. "Speak." The door opened slightly. The butler's voice came carefully through the gap. "Your Grace, the lady requests to speak with you." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. "Elena?" "Yes, Your Grace." A pause. "Then send her." The butler hesitated. "She insisted on coming herself." Another pause. Then the Duke said quietly, "Let her in." The door opened wider. Elena stepped inside. She paused immediately, because the room felt different. Not just empty, not just old, but sacred in a way she could not name. Her eyes moved quickly around it before settling on him. He stood near the fireplace, still, controlled. But something about him felt closer to the edge here. "Forgive me," she said softly. "I did not realize this room was— Do not apologize." She stopped, then nodded slightly. "I wanted to speak to you." Silence. The Duke did not move. "About Cedric," she added. At the name, something in the room tightened again. Yes, Elena took a slow breath. "He will not stop. I am aware. He has influence," she continued carefully. "Connections in London. Lawyers who will twist anything they can." The Duke's expression remained unchanged, and Elena hesitated, then said quietly, "I cannot ask you to destroy your reputation for us." A faint pause. Then the Duke replied, "You are not asking." That confused her. She frowned slightly. "Then why are you doing this?" There it was again, that question. He turned slightly toward the portrait. For a brief moment his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Then it hardened again. "Because men like Cedric Vale do not stop with one victory," he said. Elena listened carefully. "They continue," he continued, "and to someone that makes it clear that continuing is not worth surviving." A chill ran through her at the calmness of his words. "Not threat. Fact." As Elena stepped forward slightly, "That is not justice." The Duke looked at her then, directly. "And what is?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated. "I do not know. A rare honesty." The Duke studied her for a moment longer, then said quietly, "Neither does London." Silence fell between them. The fire crackled faintly in memory only. Elena's eyes shifted briefly to the portrait. "The Duchess," she said softly. "She was beautiful." A flicker crossed his expression. "Yes, she loved this room?" The Duke hesitated, longer this time. Then, "She loved anything that made me stay still long enough to exist in it." Elena blinked softly at that. Something about it hurt more than she expected, because it did not sound like romance. It sounded like survival. She looked back at him. "I think she would have liked Thomas." That landed differently. The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly. "Do not assume." "I am not assuming," Elena interrupted gently. "A beat. I am imagining." Silence. The Duke did not respond immediately. Then, "Go back to your room." Elena nodded slightly. But she did not leave right away. Instead, she looked at him one last time. "You are not as empty as you pretend to be." That sentence hung in the room longer than it should have. The Duke's jaw tightened faintly. Elena turned and walked toward the door, but before she reached it, a voice stopped her. Quiet, controlled, almost reluctant. "Elena." She turned back. He stood still beneath the weight of the portrait. "What?" A pause. Then, "If Cedric Vale returns tomorrow, do not bring the child into the hall." Elena studied him carefully. Why? The Duke's eyes flickered just once, because he understood something he had not said aloud yet. Cedric was not only dangerous, he was escalating, and men like that did not leave loose ends. Not when they believed they were entitled to them. The Duke's voice lowered slightly. "Because tomorrow," he said, "he will no longer be testing boundaries. A beat. He will be deciding how far he is willing to go to take what he believes is his." Elena's expression tightened slightly. "And you?" The Duke's eyes met hers again, cold, steady, certain. "I will be deciding how far I am willing to go to stop him." A silence followed that felt heavier than thunder. Elena nodded slowly, then left the room. The door closed behind her. The Duke remained in the sealed chamber long after she was gone. The wooden horse sat beneath the portrait, as if two broken things had found each other in the dark. Outside, the storm began to shift. Not ending, not calming, but gathering, and somewhere beyond the gates of Blackthorne Estate. Sir Cedric Vale was not returning alone tomorrow. He was returning prepared. Dawn arrived reluctantly over Blackthorne Estate, as if even the sun hesitated to touch what the night had unsettled. Mist clung low across the gardens. The iron gates were still shut, still silent, but the air carried a different weight now, expectation. Like the estate itself was holding its breath. Inside, Elena had not slept, neither had the Duke. Thomas, however, slept deeply for the first time in days, curled beneath heavy blankets in the guest chamber, one hand still clutching the edge of his mother's sleeve, as if afraid she might vanish again. Elena watched him for a long time, then quietly stood. She moved carefully through the corridor, barefoot on polished stone, until she reached the balcony overlooking the estate grounds. Below, Blackthorne looked almost peaceful. Almost, but peace, she had learned, could be deceptive in places built on old grief. Behind her, a voice spoke. "You are awake early." Elena turned. The Duke stood at the edge of the corridor, already dressed. Black coat, white shirt, gloves, as though he had never been disturbed at all. Except for his eyes, they had not rested. "I could not sleep," she admitted. A pause. The Duke stepped forward slightly. Neither could I. Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Elena asked quietly, "Is he coming?" The Duke did not pretend not to understand. "Yes." That single word carried more certainty than comfort. Elena exhaled slowly, gripping the balcony stone. "And your answer?" The Duke's gaze stayed fixed on the grounds below. "My answer has not changed, a beat. He will not take the child." Elena turned toward him fully now. "You speak as if this is already decided." "It is." Something in his tone made her uneasy, not arrogance but finality. The kind of tone men used when they had already crossed a line in their minds, and were simply waiting for the world to catch up. Elena lowered her voice. "What will you do?" The Duke finally looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something unguarded behind his expression. Not softness, but exhaustion. "I will ensure he cannot return." A chill passed through her. "That sounds like a threat." "It is not." A pause. "It is a conclusion." Before she could respond, distant hoofbeats echoed faintly beyond the estate walls. Both of them went still. The sound was slow, deliberate, not rushed like before. Elena's hands tightened slightly at her sides. The Duke did not move. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Thomas stirred upstairs faintly, unaware of what was coming. Then the gates below creaked. Slowly opening, Elena's breath caught. How did he? The Duke answered calmly without looking away. He brought authority. Below, riders entered the estate grounds in formation. Not 5 men this time. More. Well-dressed riders, legal escort, uniformed men. A carriage at the centre bearing a crest Elena recognised instantly. Her stomach dropped. "Courts!" she whispered. The Duke's expression darkened slightly. So he escalated. Elena turned toward him sharply. "You said he would come prepared." "Yes." "This is not prepared," she said urgently. "This is an attempt to take everything legally." The Duke finally looked at her again, and there was something colder in his gaze now. "He is no longer relying on force," he said quietly. "He is relying on permission." Elena swallowed. "And can he get it?" The Duke did not answer immediately. That silence told her enough. Down below, the carriage stopped. The doors opened. Sir Cedric Vale stepped out. But this time he was not alone. A sharply dressed man followed him, lawyer's coat, documents in hand, and behind them, a magistrate. Elena's heart dropped. Cedric looked up toward the estate balcony and smiled. Even from a distance, Elena felt it. Victory, not yet complete, but close enough to taste. The Duke spoke quietly beside her. "He intends to claim you are unfit." Elena stiffened. "That is impossible. He will argue instability, abandonment, improper residence, a child without legal protection." Her voice dropped. "And you?" The Duke's eyes remained on Cedric below. "I am not part of his legal argument." That made her turn fully toward him. "What does that mean?" Finally he looked at her again. And there was something controlled but dangerous behind it. "It means I am not the battlefield he is choosing." A pause. "He is trying to move this from instinct into law." Elena's hands trembled slightly. "So what do we do?" The Duke's gaze hardened faintly. "We wait." That was not what she expected. "Wait, yes. While he builds a case against us." The Duke finally turned fully toward her. "While he makes his move in public." Elena went still. Something in his tone shifted slightly then, less distant, more precise. "And when he exposes himself completely," he said quietly. "We end it." Before she could respond, a knock echoed sharply at the estate doors below once, then twice. A formal demand. The butler appeared near the entrance, hesitating, then opened it. Cedric Vale stepped inside Blackthorne Estate like he owned the law itself. Elena instinctively stepped back. The Duke did not. Cedric looked up toward the balcony once more, then smiled wider. "I have come for my son," he announced loudly. His voice carried through the hall, clear, public, intentional. The lawyer beside him lifted documents. The magistrate followed, and Cedric added, softer now, but sharper. "And I will not be leaving without him this time." A tense silence followed. Then footsteps began to rise through the estate, slow, measured. Coming upstairs, Elena's breath hitched. Thomas was still asleep. The Duke finally spoke, calm, final. "Stay here." Elena grabbed his arm. "No." His eyes flicked down to her hand, then back to her face. Something unreadable passed through him. "Elena," he said quietly, "this is no longer about hiding." A pause. "It is about choosing what survives this morning." Footsteps grew louder outside the corridor. Cedric was coming. And this time, he had brought the world with him. The footsteps stopped outside the corridor, not rushed, not uncertain, measured, like men who believed the law made them untouchable. Then a knock, once, twice, polite, deliberate. Cedric Vale's voice followed immediately after, loud enough to carry through the estate like a proclamation. Your Grace of Ravenshire, I request entry in the presence of the magistrate. Silence. Elena stood rigid beside the Duke. Her pulse was loud in her ears. From the guest chamber down the hall, Thomas shifted slightly in his sleep, unaware that the world was tightening around him again. The Duke did not move. Another knock. Your Grace? Cedric pressed, voice sharper now. Refusal to cooperate will be noted. A pause. Then the Duke spoke. Enter. The door opened. Cedric Vale stepped in first. This time he wore control-like armour. Behind him the magistrate entered with a leather-bound ledger. The lawyer followed, already unfolding papers, and 2 uniformed officers took position at the back of the corridor. It was not an intrusion any more. It was an operation. Cedric's gaze landed immediately on Elena, and softened, just slightly. Performative. My dear, he said, you look well for someone who has been misled. Elena did not respond, her hands clenched at her sides. The Duke stood between them. Not moving, not reacting, simply present, and that presence alone made Cedric adjust his tone. He turned toward the magistrate. As I stated in my petition, my wife has absconded with my son under false pretences and the assistance of this estate. The lawyer stepped forward instantly. We have affidavits confirming instability in residence, lack of legal guardianship beyond marriage bond, and concern for the child's welfare. Cedric nodded. And I am prepared to assume full custody immediately. The magistrate looked uncomfortable, but continued flipping through documents. Elena's voice finally broke through. You are lying. Cedric didn't even look at her. That is not how law works, Elena. The Duke's voice cut in, quiet, controlled. Continue. Cedric turned slightly now, finally addressing him directly. As I am certain your Grace understands, emotional attachment does not override paternal rights. A faint smile. And I trust you are aware that harbouring a child under dispute custody is legally precarious. The room tightened. The magistrate cleared his throat nervously. Lord Vale has presented sufficient grounds for temporary custody review pending full adjudication. Elena went still. Temporary. That word meant removal, immediate separation. Cedric saw the shift in her expression and let satisfaction flicker across his face. Thomas stirred again upstairs, closer now, unaware. The Duke finally spoke. You are assuming jurisdiction over my estate. The magistrate hesitated. Your Grace, this is not about estate authority. It is exactly about that, Cedric interrupted smoothly. A minor is being concealed here under the influence of an unrelated nobleman. His eyes flicked to Elena and a distressed mother, then back to the Duke. Your reputation, Ravenshire, will not survive obstruction. Silence! The lawyer stepped forward. Unless, of course, your Grace is willing to provide formal testimony that the child is not being concealed unlawfully. Cedric added softly, and that you are not acting beyond appropriate boundaries. There it was. The trap. Elena felt it instantly. This was not just custody. It was reputational collapse. If the Duke admitted involvement, Cedric would weaponize it. If he denied it, Cedric would take Thomas. Either way, Cedric won. Elena looked at the Duke urgently. No, she whispered. Do not. But the Duke raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, to steady her. Then he stepped forward, slowly. Cedric watched him carefully now, because even he understood. This man was not reacting like a cornered noble. He was deciding something. The Duke stopped directly opposite the magistrate. His voice was calm. I will answer your question, he said. The lawyer straightened immediately. Cedric's smile returned faintly. Good, the Duke continued. The child isn't concealed. The magistrate nodded. That is helpful. He is protected. A pause. Cedric's smile tightened. The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly. And I will say this once. The room went still. Even Cedric's expression shifted slightly. The Duke's voice lowered. If anyone attempts to remove that child from this estate today, a pause. And then quietly. They will not leave it again under their own authority. Silence. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop. The magistrate swallowed. Cedric stepped forward slightly. Are you threatening a legal officer of the Crown? The Duke looked at him. No, a beat. I am informing you of consequence. Something in Cedric's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. You are making a mistake. The Duke didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, not to Cedric, not to the magistrate, to the hallway behind them. Elena, he said calmly. She looked up. Take the child and go to the West Library. Her eyes widened. No, now. Something in his tone made it absolute. Elena hesitated only a moment before turning. She rushed down the corridor toward Thomas's room. Cedric noticed immediately. Stop her. One of the officers moved, but the Duke stepped sideways just enough to block him, not aggressively, effortlessly. like it was already decided. Cedric's patience snapped slightly. This is obstruction. The Duke finally looked at him again, and this time there was no distance left in his eyes. Only clarity. You made a mistake coming here, he said quietly. Cedric frowned. The Duke added, You assumed law is stronger than protection. A pause. It is not. Before anyone could react, a sudden sound echoed from below. Hoofs. Many. Fast. Not arriving. Surrounding. Cedric's expression shifted instantly. The magistrate turned toward the window. More riders were entering the estate grounds. Not Cedric's men. Different insignia. Royal Guard markings. Cedric froze. That's not possible, he muttered. The Duke's voice was calm again. It is. Cedric turned sharply. What have you done? The Duke's gaze did not waver. I stopped you from becoming comfortable. The corridor filled with rising confusion. The lawyer stepped back. The magistrate looked alarmed. Footsteps echoed again, but this time from inside the estate. Guards were entering the manor. Cedric's face tightened. This is illegal interference. No, the Duke interrupted softly. This is containment. Then very quietly, you brought law. A pause. I brought consequence, and from down the corridor Elena appeared again, Thomas now awake in her arms, clinging tightly. Her eyes met the Duke's. Fear, confusion, and something else now, trust. The Duke looked at her once, then at Cedric, and said, This ends now. Cedric Vale looked around the corridor as though the walls themselves had changed while he wasn't watching. They had. Men in dark uniforms now stood at both ends of the hallway, not servants, not estate guards, professional, controlled. Their presence was quiet, but absolute. The magistrate took an involuntary step back. The lawyer lowered his papers slightly, suddenly unsure which authority mattered more. Cedric, however, forced a laugh. This is theatrical, Ravenshire. You cannot intimidate a crown proceeding with private soldiers. The Duke didn't look at him. His attention was on Elena. She stood at the far end of the corridor. Thomas clutched tightly in her arms. The boy's face was buried in her shoulder, but his eyes peeked out, wide, alert, frightened. The Duke spoke softly. Do not look at him, he said to Elena. She understood immediately. Cedric's voice sharpened. You think this is protection? Surrounding a child with armed men? The Duke finally turned back to him, and something in his expression had settled. Not anger anymore. Decision. You came into my home, he said calmly. I came with lawful authority. You came with leverage. Cedric's jaw tightened. The Duke continued. You tried to turn fear into procedure. A pause. That was your mistake. Cedric gestured sharply toward the magistrate. Then let the court decide. The court will not be involved. The Duke interrupted. Silence fell. Even Cedric paused. The magistrate frowned. Your Grace, I must insist. The Duke raised one hand slightly, and a document was placed into the magistrate's hands by one of the uniformed men. Sealed. Stamped. The magistrate broke the seal slowly, read, then stopped. His face changed. Your Grace, he began carefully, this is a royal directive. Cedric's expression froze. The lawyer leaned in. What does it say? The magistrate swallowed. It suspends all private custody claims involving the child Thomas Vale pending protective guardianship review under Crown oversight. Cedric stared. That is impossible. The magistrate looked at him. It is signed, a beat, and countersigned. Cedric's voice dropped. By whom? The Duke spoke before the magistrate could answer. The Crown does not leave children in the hands of men like you while arguments are made. Cedric's eyes snapped to him. You arranged this. The Duke's silence confirmed it. For the first time, Cedric's confidence faltered. Elena stared from the end of the corridor, confused, shaken. The Duke had not told her. He hadn't needed to. Cedric's voice turned lower. This is political interference. The Duke stepped forward once. Just once. And the entire corridor seemed to narrow around him. No, he said quietly. This is prevention. Cedric's face hardened. You think this ends anything? The Duke looked at him for a long moment, then said, It already has. A pause. Cedric tried one last time. You will be challenged in Parliament, in court. I will drag your name through every hall in London. The Duke's expression didn't change. Try. That single word ended it. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply finally. Cedric looked around once more. At the guards, at the magistrate refusing eye contact, at the sealed authority in front of him. And for the first time, he realised he had miscalculated. Not just the Duke's influence, but his resolve. Cedric's voice lowered. This is not over, the Duke answered immediately. It is a beat. Then Cedric's shoulders stiffened slightly, pride refusing to let him bow. He adjusted his coat, looked once at Elena. Something cold passed between them. You have chosen your exile, he said softly. Then he turned and walked away. The magistrate followed quickly. The lawyer hesitated, then also retreated. The guards did not move aside until they had fully left the corridor. Only when Cedric's footsteps faded down the stairs did the tension begin to loosen. Slowly, carefully. Elena exhaled shakily. Her knees nearly gave out. Thomas lifted his head slightly. "Is he gone?" Elena nodded faintly. "Yes." The boy clung tighter. "Forever?" A pause. Elena looked toward the Duke. He did not answer immediately. Because men like Cedric Vale did not disappear easily. But they could be contained, and sometimes that was enough. The Duke finally spoke. "For now." Elena swallowed. Then walked toward him slowly, Thomas still in her arms. When she reached him, she stopped. Up close, his presence was still overwhelming, but no longer frightening, not in the same way. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, "I stopped a man from deciding your child's future." A pause. "That is all." Elena's eyes searched his face. "But why go this far?" Silence. This time he did not deflect, did not retreat into distance. He looked past her for a moment, toward the empty corridor where Cedric had stood, then back to her, and quietly said, "Because I know what it is to lose something and spend the rest of your life being told it was necessary." Elena went still. The meaning behind the words settled slowly. Not explained, not softened, just true. Thomas yawned softly against her shoulder. The danger was gone, for now. Elena shifted the boy gently, then spoke again. "You didn't have to involve the crown." The Duke's expression tightened slightly. "I did." A pause. "Because men like him return when they are merely defeated." Elena studied him carefully. "And now," the Duke's gaze softened barely, "now he cannot act without revealing himself." Silence settled between them, not tense this time, just heavy with aftermath. Then Thomas reached out sleepily from Elena's arms, toward the Duke. Elena hesitated, but the Duke stepped forward and lifted the child gently. No hesitation, no stiffness, just careful strength. Thomas immediately rested his head against his shoulder again, completely at ease. The Duke looked down at him for a moment, then quietly said, "You should rest." Elena nodded slowly. "And you?" The Duke looked up. At her, at the child, at the estate that had stopped feeling empty the moment they arrived. Then he answered, "I think I already have." And for the first time since the storm began, Blackthorne Estate was quiet in a way that no longer felt like waiting for disaster, but like the beginning of something else entirely.